Staying with us, US President Donald Trump now says he will be Vladimir Putin's worst enemy in relations with Russia. Tonight, the president, who pledged to make America great again, has once again finding himself in a position where he has to defend that relationship that he has with Putin. Let's explore this further. Our New York correspondent William Denslow is live for us now. William, good evening. Perhaps just tell us about some of the fallout that has taken place since that visit between the US president and Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, there's an incredible amount of fallout from that summit, of course, all really circling around the president's initial answers, speaking side by side with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, in Helsinki, where he was questioned on whether he felt that Russia was responsible for meddling in the 2016 US elections. And President Trump, if we cast our minds back to this summit, had essentially came out and said that while he did receive information coming from the likes of Dan Coats, the director of national intelligence in the US, as well as other intelligence agencies in the US, he also said in the same sentence that he believed that the Russian President Putin said that he spoke very strongly that Russia had no involvement whatsoever. And he said that there was no reason that Russia would. However, the US president was very quick to backtrack from that the day after, when he said that he had listened back to the transcript, saying that he misspoke, saying he should have said wouldn't instead of would. So there's really been this huge back and forth between the media and the White House in the days since that summit, and what exactly the president meant and whether he trusts his own US intelligence agencies. Now, obviously, it's come to light that the US president is now planning a second visit of a second meeting with Vladimir Putin. This time it's scheduled to take place in the fall in Washington, D.C. So while they're still very much cleaning up the effects from the first summit, it seems like the White House is now moving ahead, looking forward to a second meeting. So while there are certainly many critics stating that Donald Trump was too soft on the position with Mr. Putin, in an interview with CNBC, it seems that President Trump, publicly at least, seems to be toughening up his rhetoric.
Along with President Putin, getting along with Russia is a positive, not a negative. Right. Now, with that being said, if that doesn't work out, I'll be the worst enemy he's ever had. The worst he's ever had.
All right, William, now let's talk about how perhaps both the Republicans and the Democrats have responded to all of this.
Absolutely. Now, this is something that we've really seen on both sides of the political aisle, really coming out strongly against the president, especially initially after that summit a couple of days ago. We heard from Paul Ryan, the House Speaker in the United States, a Republican from Wisconsin, who came out and said that Russia is not an ally of the United States. Of course, as you might expect, incredibly strong messages coming from leading Democrats, including Chuck Schumer, the Senate minority leader, coming out and essentially stating that he feels that the US president was weak when it came to the position on Russia. So we're seeing really a strong unifying message when it comes to this stance. But the message from the White House is incredibly clear. President Trump has consistently stated, even on the campaign trail before he was elected president, that in his mind it would be better for the United States and Russia to have a strong working relationship. And that seems to have very much stayed the same from President Trump. Obviously, we've just heard that clip where he did have a somewhat tougher message to President Putin, but he does consistently reiterate that he wants Russia and the United States to get along. President Trump stated at this summit that he'd rather peace over politics.
Right, let's leave it there for tonight. William Denslow, he's in New York for us. In studio with me, political analyst Brooks Spector joins me. Thanks for your time tonight, Brooks. It's always a pleasure talking to you. I think before we get into the nitty-gritty, put the situation in context for us. What are we really looking at here?
Well, what we're looking at is a president in the United States who has argued in various versions he is the world's best negotiator, and he can make whatever it is come out right for himself and ultimately for the country. A man who quite clearly has something of a love affair with authoritarian rulers, first with Kim Jong-un, then with Vladimir Putin, and previously with Xi Jinping. And he continues to express the idea that these are strong people, they are in charge, almost as if he's envious. He wishes that he didn't have to deal with all those Rottweilers nipping at his heels in the press and in Congress and elsewhere. But we're also dealing with a president who has no real clear ideas and understanding of international security policy, the historical and historic arrangements for mutual defense under NATO, and a general lack of understanding of geopolitics that is further fueled by the fact that he resolutely refuses to take advice, to listen to other people who may actually know more about something. People are prepared to give him that he probably knows more about financing the building of a new skyscraper than they do. But contra, they know more about the ins and outs of the diplomatic relationship historically between the United States and the Soviet Union and then the United States and Russia than he does. And he has been unable to accept that in any meaningful kind of way. Evidence to that is very clear. He went into that meeting with Vladimir Putin one-on-one, just interpreters. Nobody taking notes. He hadn't had the briefing sessions and the preparation sessions that were necessary for this. And so now no one really knows what they discussed, what they agreed to, what they disagreed to, whether Donald Trump put forth forcefully the case that you really, really must stop this interference with electoral systems and electoral politics and cyber phishing and hacking, and all of the other issues, the shooting down of the Malaysian air passenger jet, the annexation forcibly of Crimea, and an attack in Georgia, and then the support of irregulars in eastern Ukraine. And of course, the British were more than a little bit upset because he apparently didn't raise the nerve toxin poisoning of the two people in Britain, and obviously then the one woman who died later on, most recently. So you have a president now who's had to back and fill and explain that he meant to say a double negative, and no, he really was accepting of what the government says. And then today, you have this extraordinary spectacle of the the Chief Office of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, a Donald Trump appointee who is taken totally off guard when his interviewer at a conference on international security says, by the way, you've heard, haven't you, that the president invited Vladimir Putin for a summit in Washington? And Coats, who was a longtime Republican congressman, fell apart laughing. Is it really?
Oh, really? Did that happen? You know, and Brooks, before we move on to our next subject, what is he really tampering with here in terms of global order, in terms of allies, and I suppose the balance of forces that has maintained how the world works and how things run today? Well,
he's busy pushing at every one of the pieces of the post-World War II order that were established, whether it's the UN, whether it's NATO, whether it's the World Bank, whether it's the International Monetary Fund, whether it's more recently the World Trade Organization. Each of these things to him is an intrusion on America's safety and security, when in fact they are all part of a system which was put together to provide the kind of security that the globe has largely, not completely, but largely been the beneficiary of. And in his most recent version of things, I think even more important than this bizarre spectacle of the Helsinki summit and its aftermath is his constant push for more and stronger trade tariff initiatives. The Chinese are now convinced, apparently, that he will push for a tariff on every Chinese import into the United States, and they're prepared, obviously, to enact other measures to counter that. This is dangerous and extraordinary stuff.
Brooks, I'm going to move us to the very next point, at least that affects us locally. Next week, we have the BRICS summit that is being hosted in South Africa. And of course, Russia is one of those countries that forms, yes, that forms part of the BRICS. Very briefly, in a minute, what are your expectations around next week's summit?
I think there'll be a meeting that they will declare as successful. They will issue a communique at the end that speaks to increased initiatives to encourage more investment and trade. They will strongly support, although the Russians and Chinese will have a little bit of an issue with this, strongly support reform of international global institutions, financial and political. And there'll be many brave and delightful statements about how they will improve international cooperation on culture and communications. There'll be very little discussion about freedom of the press, freedom of association. There'll be very little discussion about the role of NGOs, other than perhaps to allude to the possibility that these are insidious forces from the outside.
But do you also think that how the relations within BRICS also then lend themselves to, you look at Brazil and China and the trade that takes on between those two countries, and how China is also intervening, you know, at least with or funding some of the infrastructure projects that are taking place in Brazil? The relationship seems to be very unequal amongst the various countries. Do you think that that has a role in how BRICS is able to function?
Well, partly take the economies, the GDP of all the members. If you put all of them plus one, that is everybody except China, you don't equal China's. So you add India and Russia and here and Brazil, it's not even close. And the Chinese, BRICS is simply one of the arrows in the Chinese quiver. I think for them a much more important activity is what they call the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a whole series of structured efforts to tie trade and investment and financial incentives to a whole swathe of countries moving from southern East Asia on through South Asia and into the Middle East and into Africa, because for the Chinese, that ultimately is where their trade future lies. Those are growing economies, those are places where there are lots of consumers, and there's certainly a demand for infrastructure investment in almost every one of them.
All right, Brooks, that's all we have time for tonight. That's where we leave it. Brooks Spector wrapping up at least some of the important stories that have taken place nationally, or internationally rather, with the US, and of course next week South Africa hosting that BRICS summit. Well, Israel has pushed through a new law defining the country as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing coalition party is calling it a historic move, but opponents are calling it racist and anti-democratic. Here are some of those comments.
The nationality bill is a hate crime. They are totally discriminating against the Arab citizens, against the Arab minority, with racist articles, especially those of Jewish settlements, and those articles downgrading the status of the Arabic languages.